So at this point, we can render our markdown just fine. We've been able to actually display our posts in a way that is fairly conducive to a real blog. Granted, the images themselves being responsive is really important, but also the fact that we can actually render out the markdown, that's also important. But the thing that's really missing here is the truncating of characters. That is, cutting off the post so it's not showing the entire post in the preview, right? So it technically should be a preview of the post, not the entire post. And this creates some issues for us when it actually means rendering or using the markdown content, because we can't actually truncate markdown content directly, or at least there isn't a simple solution to do so. Of course, we could make a solution, but in the case of developing stuff, you shouldn't try and fix something that's broken just to make it work. Instead, we should be creative and think of other kinds of solutions on how we can do this. So what we've been doing so far is using JavaScript to actually render the markdown, right? To turn the markdown into HTML. JavaScript, or the jQuery library, has been doing that for us. And also that third-party library for markdown itself. But we don't want to do that anymore. Instead, we want Django to do it. We want the backend to do it. And that's what we're going to be doing now, is we're going to actually be implementing the Django Markdown Deuce, which is basically Django Markdown 2. This is using Markdown or Python Markdown 2 library to actually render the markdown exactly the way we want it to. So in the case for this one, it's a fairly straightforward library itself. So we're going to go ahead and copy the install for it, and we're going to go into our virtual environment and install this one in. I already have mine installed, but yours will install in just a moment. And then we have to add Markdown Deuce to our actual settings. So instead of installed apps, right above page down, we're going to add Markdown Deuce. And then we're going to go back into into the documentation itself and take a look at a few things here. Now, first of all, we can render it inside of the template. This isn't completely necessary for us because we've already set up a way to render it on the template view, basically, right? So we can have it be in the template as a filter. We could do that, and I encourage you to check out what that looks like, but that's not what we want to do. Instead, we want to render it on the actual, create an actual method that will render it out for us, and that's the markdown deuce.markdown. That's going to take our text and turn it into markdown. And we're going to do this by using an instance method inside of our models. If all of that is kind of confusing, it's going to make a lot of sense here in just a moment. So I'm going to go ahead and jump into models.py, where we defined our post model itself. So every time you see a define and then some function name, that is an instance method. So we're just going to create our own version of that so we can use it inside of our template. And instead of using object.content, we will use object.getMarkdown. So let's just call it getMarkdown. So that's what we're going to be doing. We're going to make that instance method now inside of our models. And we're going to define getMarkdown because that's what we're calling it. So there's a custom method. We're just doing our own thing here. And we're going to return, well, I want to return, of course, the content itself. So let's just grab the content first, and we'll say content equals to self.content. So since it's an instance method, it's saying the instance or whatever that object is, go ahead and grab that content, which is what's going to be stored in that item of the database. And then we want to return this content and turn it into the markdown deuce itself. So at the very top, right underneath Django utils, I'm going to import markdown deuce. We're going to be using markdown deuce.markdown. Well, you can also do from markdown deuce import markdown. So we can do that as well. That's actually how I'll keep it. And then down in our get markdown here, I'm going to do markdown and content. So all this is doing is converting that content into markdown as we would expect. So if I save this and go back into my post list where I did get markdown method in anyway, I'm going to get rid of this content markdown right here. Save that. And we'll go back into advancing the blog and refresh. Let's make sure the server is running, of course. And we see actual content. So it actually rendered out the image as HTML. Unfortunately, we didn't actually set up anything for the image, right? So we have the image in there, but we didn't say like, oh, this is safe content, right? So this is actually safe HTML content. So we can use a template tag in here, and it's called safe. This is a template tag filter, and we can refresh in here, and boom, all of a sudden the image is back. That's cool. So of course it's not responsive right now because I removed that one class, which we will come back to that. But that's actually not how I want to do it. I want, whenever I say .get markdown, I want that to already be safe. I want Django's templates to assume that it is safe data. Now, this is something that if you're doing it in your template, if you're marking it safe in your template, then you're going to assume that in your forms it is safe, right? But saving the data and rendering it is not exactly the same thing. So going back into our models, we want to change this to being safe. And there's a utility function that allows us to do that. So from django.utils.safe_string import mark safe. And we're going to copy that and just wrap it outside of this markdown stuff. So just like this. I could do it like that, but I'm going to separate it out so it's a little bit easier for you guys. Markdown text equals to markdown content. And we're going to mark that safe. And it's going to return it. Now if we refresh and get rid of this safe, so the safe is gone. We refresh in here. Of course, it's still showing up as expected. Now, if we bring back down on our post detail and we want to do the same thing, we absolutely can. So we can just do get markdown here. And content markdown can stay. But instead of calling it content markdown, I'm going to say post detail item. So post detail item, that's what I'm going to call that class now, and I'll explain that in a second. And I'm going to copy that and go into post list and add in to where our content is. We're going to add in that specifically. So right there. So post detail item. The reason we're doing this is because then in our base.html, instead of using content markdown for the image class, we'll use post detail item. That's really just to keep content markdown as a class, only marking down content, and that's all it's really doing. This additional class that we added is to, if we want to do other type of CSS or other things that we want. So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this console log stuff too. We're going to save that, refresh in here, and let's make sure we save everywhere. And it looks like we're having some issues with the actual images. So let's go ahead and look in here. And we've got post detail item. It's not actually rendering inside of that post detail item. So let's go ahead and make sure that we've got that correct on our post list. So I'm going to go ahead and cut this out actually, and put the post detail item inside of the caption class and refresh in here. And there we go. So just a slight change because of how the markdown was being rendered on the back end. It was creating a new class and it wasn't actually wrapping inside of the class that we have here. So we can actually get rid of that paragraph class too because it's going to create its own. So it's slightly different from what we did before, but it still works. And then back into our post detail, we're probably gonna have to do that same thing, but let's go ahead and take a look. And what we see here is it's actually not even showing up. So let's go ahead and I'm going to cut this out and get rid of that class markdown stuff. And there we go. So once we got rid of that other markdown class, it actually came back. So if we have content markdown and the markdown being rendered already, it doesn't appear to be working in this case. So we're just going to leave it as this and keep this from going, or keep it this way when we go forward. But of course, we can have a method that gets raw markdown, or we could just return the content itself. So the content itself, again, is going to be coming through as markdown. And if we ever want to use that class again, the specific class of content markdown, we can, and that will allow us to actually change any of those things. So if you have any questions on what we did here, let us know. Otherwise, let's keep going.